Chapter 1. Ashcroft House stood at the edge of Beechwood-on-Hart, like a memory no one wanted to disturb. Its ivy-covered walls steeped in a quiet sort of defiance against the modern world. The house had hosted generations of discreet quarrels and afternoon teas, and on this particular Saturday it welcomed both once again. Mrs. Isabel Greyston, recently widowed and quietly resented for it, had invited a select few to her seasonal evening gathering, a term she used to avoid calling it a dinner party. Miss Marple, seated near the fireplace, had not been formally invited, only gently ushered in by social necessity and an old obligation owed to the late Reverend Greyston, a man who had once said Miss Marple's mind was sharper than any bishop's. The exact drawing-room was warm, its air humming with polite conversation and the faintest tension. A fire crackled behind the carved oak mantel, above which hung a heavy tapestry, dark green and gold, fraying at the corners. From her position in the floral armchair, Miss Marple found her gaze returning to that tapestry again and again. "Curious, isn't it?" said Colonel Merriman, easing himself beside her with a brandy in hand. "Looks older than the house itself." Miss Marple smiled. Sometimes the things that appear older simply haven't been handled as often. Across the room, a tight circle had formed near the canapé table. Lydia Ashcroft, the late Mr. Greyston's niece, young and intelligent with a guarded smile, stood beside her fiancé, Dr. Felix Merriweather. He looked uncomfortable, as if wearing his dinner jacket out of duty rather than ease. A man too precise, Miss Marple thought, not in his clothing, but in his conversation. The kind who spoke in declarative sentences, rarely softened by doubt. Isabel, meanwhile, had positioned herself like a queen among pawns, her silk dress the colour of mourning, but with a neckline that suggested recovery. She held court with Mrs. Wicks, the vicar's wife, and a newcomer to Beechwood, Mr. Byron Vale, a playwright recently retired from London's West End due to scandalous rumours no one dared to repeat directly. "Darling," Isabel called across the room, "do fetch me another sherry, would you?" Her voice, though sweet, cracked like a whip. The darling in question, her brother Edmund Ashcroft, looked up from the piano stool, where he had been idly pressing soft chords. He did not smile. "Of course," he said, rising slowly. He was pale, a man who had never quite stepped out of someone else's shadow. First their father's, then his younger sister's. Miss Marple watched him cross the room with the weary grace of a man who'd long accepted he'd never be asked to lead the dance. As the sherry was poured and candles flickered, the atmosphere grew denser, like a parlour game, waiting for someone to say the wrong word. Miss Marple turned slightly as a voice rose behind her. "Lydia again. Do you really believe that, Felix? That some people are just born dishonest?" "Absolutely," Dr. Merriweather replied. "There's a condition, can't recall the term, but it's a lack of empathy, a psychological inability to feel guilt. Makes them excellent liars. I've had patients like that." Lydia glanced at Isabel, then back. "Sounds convenient." Felix didn't blink. "It's science." Miss Marple pretended not to hear, but she registered every syllable. In small villages like Beechwood-on-Hart, conversations often doubled as coded warnings. The evening wound down with a half-hearted card game. Mr. Vale retired early, with a theatrical sigh. Lydia and Felix departed arm in arm. Isabel kissed everyone's cheeks like royalty. Colonel Merriman, half asleep in his chair, murmured something about the tapestry having moved slightly in the breeze. When the final guest had gone, and the hallway had hushed, Miss Marple retrieved her shawl from the coat stand. She paused just a moment beneath the tapestry. The fire had dimmed to embers, and in the quiet flicker of orange light, the fabric did seem to shift, just the gentlest ripple. But there was no breeze in the room, none at all. She let her fingers touch the edge. Beneath the velvet fringe, the stone wall was oddly cool, too cool for such a fire. "Good night, dear," Isabel's voice broke through. "Let me have cook send over one of those little seed cakes you like tomorrow." "That's very kind," Miss Marple replied. She stepped out into the chilled night, her mind busy. The tapestry had stirred something in her, like a whisper, a murmur, and by morning there would be a death. Chapter 2. By the next morning, the village of Beechwood-on-Hart had begun its weekly ritual of polite judgment. It started at the bakery, Q, as most reliable gossip did. Mrs. Tilling, who ran the flower stall and pretended not to pry, leaned slightly closer to Mrs. Lumley, who never pretended anything at all. "Did you hear about the gathering at Ashcroft House?" Mrs. Tilling whispered, breaking a scone in half as if it might yield secrets. "Quite the crowd." Mrs. Lumley, already 2 steps ahead, nodded. "And not everyone stayed the full evening. Mr. Vale left early. Looked pale, they say." "Pale?" Mrs. Tilling blinked. "That playwright? Thought he'd seen worse on the West End." "Or caused worse," came the reply, just as Miss Marple stepped in behind them with her usual cloth bag. She offered a gentle smile. "Good morning, ladies. The almond buns look especially lovely today." Mrs. Lumley flushed slightly. "Oh, morning, Miss Marple. Were you at the gathering too?" "I was," Miss Marple said, selecting a bun with deliberate care. "A lovely arrangement of orchids on the piano. A rather subdued evening otherwise." She paid her coin and moved on, leaving the 2 women blinking at each other like hens who'd missed a fox in the hen-house. But even as the village picked over details, real and imagined, the true unease began at Ashcroft House. Isabel Greyston awoke late, as was her habit. When cook didn't bring the tea tray by 8:30, she summoned the housemaid Ivy, only to find the girl in tears. It's Mr. Edmund, ma'am," Ivy choked. "He's not answering." Ivy choked. "He's not answering." Isabel frowned, drawing her dressing gown tighter. "He's probably sulking. He drinks when he's sulking. Check the cellar." But Ivy was trembling now. "I did. He wasn't there. He's still in bed, I think, but he's not moving." There was something about Ivy's voice, shrill yet flat, that pierced Isabel's defenses. She descended the hallway herself, her slippers whispering over the rug. She knocked once on Edmund's door, twice. No answer. She pushed it open. Church curtains had not been drawn. Morning light spilled across the room, touching the decanter on the bedside table, the folded suit from the night before, and Edmund, very still, one arm outside the covers, the other curled against his chest. Isabel crossed the room and touched his shoulder. "Cold. Fetch Dr. Merriweather," she said without inflection. "Now." By noon, Beechwood buzzed like a shaken beehive. The news spread quickly. Edmund Ashcroft, dead in his sleep. No visible injuries. Peaceful, they said. A heart, perhaps. Miss Marple walked the narrow lane to the vicarage, with her knitting in one hand, and a question already forming in her mind. She'd heard from the grocer's boy. Died in his sleep, miss, like one of them saints, quiet as anything. Saints rarely drank 2 glasses of sherry before bed, she thought, or moved like a man who'd rather vanish than be seen. At the vicarage, Mrs. Wicks poured tea with visible anxiety. "Such a shock," she muttered. "Isabel says he hadn't been ill at all. Not a day's trouble." Miss Marple stirred her tea without drinking. "But she's not terribly distraught?" "Oh, she's in pieces, of course," Mrs. Wicks replied a bit too quickly. "Only, I imagine she had her own way of grieving." "She always did," Miss Marple murmured. "And Lydia, she was fond of her uncle." Mrs. Wicks hesitated. "Well, it's not for me to say, but she was quiet." And Dr. Merriweather looked grim. "He's examining the body now, I believe." Miss Marple looked down at her knitting again. She wasn't counting stitches. She was reviewing faces, expressions, words left hanging. Back at Ashcroft House, Dr. Merriweather wiped his hands on a towel and faced Isabel in the hallway. "It appears natural," he said. "No signs of struggle or trauma." "Appears?" she asked sharply. "So, you're not certain?" He paused. "The coroner may wish to review. There was some discoloration, not inconsistent with a cardiac episode, but—" He trailed off. "But," Isabel pressed. Felix exhaled. There was a faint bitterness on the breath. "Almonds." Isabel blinked. He detested marzipan. "It may mean nothing," the doctor said, "but I must record it." Isabel folded her arms. "You'll be discreet, I assume. The family doesn't need speculation." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the local churchyard, ostensibly to look at winter bulbs. Instead, she found herself facing Lydia, who stood by the stone bench beneath the yew tree. "He seemed different lately," Lydia said quietly. "Uncle Edmund more withdrawn, unwell perhaps, but he wouldn't say." Miss Marple watched a robin flick dust off a gravestone nearby. "It's often the way with men, especially those who have long lived under someone else's roof." Lydia nodded but didn't reply. Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward Lydia's hands, clenched tightly at her sides, even as her voice remained soft. "You were fond of him." "I was. He was the only one who ever really saw me. Not the way Isabel does, or Felix." Miss Marple waited. Lydia added, "He told me something once, last summer. Said if anything happened to him, I should look behind the mantle." "Behind the mantle?" Miss Marple echoed lightly. Lydia glanced at her. "I thought he meant metaphorically." Miss Marple smiled gently. "So did I, until last night." Chapter 3. Miss Marple returned to Ashcroft House under the soft pretense of condolence. She arrived with a jar of blackcurrant preserve and a suggestion that grief required sugar. Isabel accepted it with the mechanical grace of a woman performing emotion, not feeling it. "I've had 3 visitors already this morning," Isabel said flatly. "The vicar, Mrs. Tilling, and now you. The parade of concern begins." Miss Marple offered a gentle nod. "It's a burden, I'm sure." "Oh, not entirely unpleasant," Isabel added. "Edmund always drew fuss. Even now, he manages it." They sat in the morning room. where a single vase of lilies offered the only nod to morning. Miss Marple observed the room's careful elegance, the fire unlit, the hearth swept too clean. "I wonder," Miss Marple said after a pause, "if I might step into the drawing-room before I go, just to say a prayer where we all last sat together." Isabel blinked. "If it gives you comfort. The room's just as we left it, though the fire's out." Miss Marple moved quietly through the hallway, her footsteps soft on the runner. The drawing-room door creaked ever so slightly as it opened, revealing a familiar hush. She crossed to the mantel. The tapestry still hung, heavy and unmoved, but she now noticed a faint scrape along the stone beneath, almost like something had been dislodged and pushed back too hastily. She leaned in, running her fingers along the lower edge until they found it, a groove. With a gentle tug, the panel behind the tapestry shifted open. It wasn't a safe or compartment, not exactly, just a narrow cavity between the stone and the wooden paneling. And within it, folded in thirds, edged at the corners, was a single sheet of paper. She read it quickly, lips pressed into a line. Then she slipped it into her sleeve. By afternoon, rain had begun to fall in light, persistent drizzles, enough to keep Beechwood's gossips indoors, but not their imaginations. At the post office, Mrs. Lumley whispered about poisons while pretending to examine postcards. Mr. Vale, meanwhile, smoked beside the war memorial, watching passers-by with distant amusement. Lydia found Miss Marple outside the greengrocer's. "Did you check?" "I did," Miss Marple replied. "He left you a truth, or at least a beginning of one." "Of one?" Lydia's lips parted, but she didn't speak. "He wrote a name," Miss Marple said gently. "A single one." "Whose? Yours?" The younger woman paled. "Mine?" "In large letters," Miss Marple continued, "and below it, knows everything. No explanation, no signature, just those words." Lydia looked away, her voice tightening. "He must have meant something else. He can't have meant—" Miss Marple studied her not unkindly. "Sometimes men who know too much say very little, especially when they know they haven't much time left." "I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I don't think you did." Lydia blinked. "You don't?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Because people rarely kill out of opportunity alone. They kill when they're cornered. And you, dear, are far too calm for someone trapped." Later that evening, Dr. Merriweather sat across from the coroner in his cramped surgery. The window rattled softly as the wind picked up outside. "No visible trauma," the coroner said. "You were right about the breath. I'll run proper tests. Bitterness like that could be cyanide, could be almond essence. No sense speculating until we're sure." Felix nodded, but his gaze drifted. "Was he the sort to, well, you know, take his own life?" Felix flinched. "No. Edmund Ashcroft didn't believe in self-inflicted anything. He once refused to extract a tooth, said pain was part of the divine order." The coroner chuckled, then sobered. "Well, divine order or not, if this was suicide, it was meticulous. No note, no sign, no disturbance." Felix exhaled. "And if it wasn't, then someone in that house knows how to stage a death with clinical precision." That night, Miss Marple sat by the small fire in her parlour, rereading the note by lamplight. The handwriting was rushed, likely done in secrecy, and the phrase "knows everything" lingered. What Had Lydia known? What had Egmont feared? Unsure, why hide the note instead of sending it? She recalled something Colonel Merriman had said at the gathering. Looks older than the house itself. He had meant the tapestry, but he had also said it had moved in the night. If Edmund had hidden the note recently, it meant he'd felt endangered, perhaps even expected to be silenced. Yet Miss Marple sensed the killer, if one existed, hadn't meant to be theatrical. No flourishes, no dramatic announcements, just silence. The kind of silence that lived in drawing rooms and marriages. She made a note to speak to Mr. Byron Vale. Playwrights often saw the stage, even when off it, and Miss Marple had seen him watching everyone far too closely to be idle. Chapter 4. By the time the coroner's preliminary findings reached Inspector Cray from the county constabulary, the rain had turned the village roads into glistening threads of mud. Cyanide, confirmed, though in such a minimal dosage that it would have taken precise timing and placement to be fatal, administered within an hour of death, the report concluded. Possibly ingested, possibly inhaled. Inspector Cray, a man of logical mind but limited imagination, found himself pacing the hallway of Ashcroft House that very afternoon, not entirely pleased to be pulled from his warm desk in East Downs. I've seen 3 poisonings in 20 years, he said aloud, more to himself than to the gathered household, and none of them tidy. Isabel stood at the window, unmoving. Her silk blouse, uncharacteristically crumpled, did little to soften the impression that she was restraining fury, not grief. "I trust you're not suggesting suicide," she said. "I'm suggesting nothing," Cray replied evenly. "But the death was deliberate. Someone made sure your brother wouldn't wake up." Across the room, Felix Merriweather shifted in his chair. "Surely, Lydia, surely none of us had reason to do something so grotesque." "Opportunity," Cray muttered. "That's what matters now. You all had access." Lydia, seated near the cold fireplace, finally spoke. "And what motive would we have, Inspector? The man was harmless." "Harmless is not the same as liked," Cray said. "But since you've asked, he altered his will last month, left a generous sum to a Miss Lydia Ashcroft, bypassing his sister entirely." Isabel turned from the window. "He wouldn't," Cray raised a brow. "He did." A long silence followed. Then Miss Marple's voice, calm and unassuming, broke it. "I wonder if the will was witnessed." Cray looked at her. "Yes, by Mr. Byron Vale and the housemaid. Both confirm it was signed and sealed in the study." "Curious," Miss Marple mused. "Mr. Vale hadn't known Edmund for long, had he?" "Only a few weeks," Lydia murmured. "He arrived after the theatre scandal. He rents from the Ralstons. Why?" But Miss Marple only smiled faintly. "No reason, dear. Only writers are good with secrets." The next morning, Mr. Vale found Miss Marple waiting outside the bakery, her coat dusted lightly with flour from the mill lane. "Miss Marple," he said, with the easy charm of someone used to applause, "come to accuse me of murder over crumpets. I find accusations to be dreadfully premature things," she said mildly, "though I do find playwrights often more observant than they admit." Vale tucked his hands into his coat pockets. "And you'd like to know what I observed?" "If you're willing," she said. He leaned slightly closer. "Isabel is always performing Lydia never blinks when she lies. Felix thinks too highly of his intellect, and Edmund, poor fool, was either being blackmailed or trying to stop someone who was. Why blackmail? I saw him burning letters in the garden shed a week before the party. Looked over his shoulder the whole time. That's not grief or nostalgia. That's fear. Miss Marple nodded once. And did you happen to glimpse one of those letters? Enough to know it was addressed from Hastings. Same paper stock, same loop in the capital H. Ah, said Miss Marple, you do pay attention. Ickle gave her a wry smile. I watch people for a living, Miss Marple, but you— He gestured at her knitting bag. You listen. That's more dangerous. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray interviewed the Hudson. That's more dangerous. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray interviewed the housemaid Ivy again, this time in the servants' corridor, with a constable making notes nearby. You said you brought Mr. Edmund his usual tea tray the night before? Yes, sir. Anything different about him? She fidgeted. Quieter than normal. Said he'd skip biscuits, just wanted the tea. Did he drink it? She nodded. Half the cup, I think. I cleared it in the morning. Cray scratched at his notebook. And you didn't notice anything odd? Smell? Colour? No, sir, but— She hesitated. He didn't lock his door. He always locked it. Cray blinked. Always? Since autumn, Ivy whispered. He said people came into his room at night, but when I asked who, he wouldn't say. Cray stood abruptly, closing the notebook. That's enough for now. As he left the corridor, he passed Miss Marple once again. He looked tired. You seem doubtful, Inspector, she said lightly. He sighed. Everyone's too clean. Even their lies are tidy. Miss Marple tilted her head. But you see, Inspector, lies are often polished. It's the truth that's messy. Chapter 5. Miss Marple returned to Ashcroft House not as a guest this time, but under the polite fiction of delivering wool to Ivy, the housemaid. A small skein of grey for her mother's scarf, she explained, knowing full well that Ivy's mother had passed 3 years ago. But Ivy didn't question her. In Beechwood-on-Hart, lies wrapped in kindness were rarely challenged. They met in the scullery, where steam curled from the open kettle, and the scent of starch lingered over folded linens. I wanted to ask you something, Ivy, Miss Marple began softly, about Mr. Edmund's tea tray. Ivy glanced up from the tin she was polishing. I told the inspector everything. I know, dear, but sometimes the smallest things slip between larger truths. Ivy hesitated, then wiped her hands. Well, there was one thing. Miss Marple waited. The teacup. When I cleared it, it was the wrong one. The wrong one? It wasn't from his set, Ivy whispered. He always used the green-rimmed ones with the thistle pattern. This one had violets. From which room? Ivy glanced toward the hallway. That set's kept in the guest-room cupboard. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the skein of yarn. And who stayed in the guest-room recently? No one. Not since Mr. Vale had the fever 2 weeks ago and stayed the night. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. Thank you, Ivy. That's all. Later that day, Miss Marple sat across from Colonel Merriman on the sunlit bench outside the village shop. He was thumbing through the Telegraph with the vague disinterest of a man waiting for something to become relevant. You remember the tapestry? Miss Marple asked after a lull. He looked up. Still thinking about it, are you? Well, you said something curious that evening. That it moved, did I? He squinted. Ah, yes, odd that. I could have sworn it fluttered near the corner. Thought it might have been a draught, but the fire was high. Miss Marple nodded. No windows open. Not a one. I checked. Bit chilled in that room. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. That corner, Colonel, was it near the fire or away from it? Left-hand side facing the hearth, closest to the mantle's edge. Thank you, she said more to herself than him, because that was the side with the hidden cavity. Chico, panel she had found slightly ajar. It had been opened during the evening, after Edmund's tea, but before his death. Someone else had read the note. Someone who'd known it needed to be retrieved before the police searched the house. But they had missed it. Or no, they had replaced it, rewritten it. That evening Miss Marple asked to see Edmund's personal effects. Cray, weary and increasingly suspicious of everything, allowed it under the condition that he observe. You believe there's something here? He asked as she gently sifted through the dead man's desk drawer. I believe that truth hides in routine, Miss Marple murmured, and that people, when afraid, rarely think in straight lines. Inside the drawer, ledgers, scribbled notes on estate repairs, and 3 envelopes, 2 blank, one with a return address in Hastings. She opened the Hastings envelope. Inside was a letter written in a delicate hand, dated 4 months prior. It read, Dearest E., you said not to write again, but I must. I saw the play. He took everything from us. You deserve to be heard. Yours in memory and in silence. See Miss Marple's. Gaze lingered. You see, Inspector, writers never stop writing, even when they change names. Cray frowned. You think Mr. Vale wrote this? I think he inspired it. At dusk, Miss Marple asked to revisit the drawing-room once more. Isabel, too exhausted or too indifferent, waved her in. This time Miss Marple didn't look at the tapestry. She looked at the hearth. A soot mark, faint, crescent-shaped, had been scrubbed but not entirely removed. She knelt slightly and ran her fingers along the inner curve of the fire grate. There! A chipped edge. Someone had dropped something small. Glass, perhaps. She reached in and withdrew it with the corner of her handkerchief. A button. Porcelain. Violets on white, matching the guest-room teacups. Across the room, Felix Merriweather shifted in his chair. Surely Lydia, surely none of us, had reason to do something so grotesque. Opportunity, Cray muttered. That's what matters now. You all had access. Lydia, seated near the cold fireplace, finally spoke. And what motive would we have, Inspector? The man was harmless. Harmless is not the same as liked, Cray said. But since you've asked, he altered his will last month, left a generous sum to a Miss Lydia Ashcroft, bypassing his sister entirely. Isabel turned from the window. He wouldn't, Cray raised a brow. He did. A long silence followed. Then Miss Marple's voice, calm and unassuming, broke it. I wonder if the will was witnessed. Cray looked at her. Yes, by Mr. Byron Vale and the housemaid. Both confirm it was signed and sealed in the study. Curious, Miss Marple mused. Mr. Vale hadn't known Edmund for Mr. Vale hadn't known Edmund for long, had he? Only a few weeks, Lydia murmured. He arrived after the theatre scandal. He rents from the Ralstons. Why?" But Miss Marple only smiled faintly. "No reason, dear. Only writers are good with secrets." The next morning, Mr. Vale found Miss Marple waiting outside the bakery, her coat dusted lightly with flour from the mill lane. "Miss Marple," he said, with the easy charm of someone used to applause, "come to accuse me of murder over crumpets. I find accusations to be dreadfully premature things," she said mildly, "though I do find playwrights often more observant than they admit." Vale tucked his hands into his coat pockets. "And you'd like to know what I observed?" "If you're willing," she said. He leaned slightly closer. "Isabel is always performing. Lydia never blinks when she lies. Felix thinks too highly of his intellect. And Edmund, poor fool, was either being blackmailed or trying to stop someone who was." "Why blackmail?" "I saw him burning letters in the garden shed a week before the party. Looked over his shoulder the whole time. That's not grief or nostalgia. That's fear." Miss Marple nodded once. "And did you happen to glimpse one of those letters?" "Enough to know it was addressed from Hastings. Same paper stock. Same loop in the capital H." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "you do pay attention." Ickle gave her a wry smile. "I watch people for a living, Miss Marple, but you—" He gestured at her knitting bag. "You listen. That's more dangerous." Meanwhile, Inspector Cray interviewed the housemaid Ivy again, this time in the servants' corridor, with a constable making notes nearby. "You said you brought Mr. Edmund his usual tea tray the night before?" "Yes, sir." "Anything different about him?" She fidgeted. "Quieter than normal. Said he'd skip biscuits, just wanted the tea." "Did he drink it?" She nodded. "Half the cup, I think. I cleared it in the morning." Cray scratched at his notebook. "And you didn't notice anything odd? Smell? Color?" "No, sir, but—" She hesitated. "He didn't lock his door. He always locked it." Cray blinked. "Always?" "Since autumn," Ivy whispered. "He said people came into his room at night, but when I asked who, he wouldn't say." Cray stood abruptly, closing the notebook. "That's enough for now." As he left the corridor, he passed Miss Marple once again. He looked tired. "You seem doubtful, Inspector," she said lightly. He sighed. "Everyone's too clean. Even their lies are tidy." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Ha! But you see, Inspector, lies are often polished. It's the truth that's messy." Chapter 5. Miss Marple returned to Ashcroft House not as a guest this time, but under the polite fiction of delivering wool to Ivy, the housemaid. "Aye, a small skein of grey for her mother's scarf," she explained, knowing full well that Ivy's mother had passed 3 years ago. But Ivy didn't question her. In Beechwood-on-Hart, lies wrapped in kindness were rarely challenged. She didn't smile, not yet, but something had shifted in her mind, a new shape behind the curtain of facts. Outside, the village was quiet again, the kind of quiet that knew better than to trust itself. Inside, Miss Marple folded the handkerchief carefully, a mismatched cup, a rewritten note, a button in the ashes, and behind it all, someone counting on appearances too carefully. People lied to survive, but only the guilty lied in advance. Chapter 6. Beechwood-on-Hart wasn't a village accustomed to confession. It was a place of veiled remarks and unspoken rules. where emotions were ironed flat over breakfast and buried before luncheon. But something had shifted since Edmund Ashcroft's death. People talked a little faster, watched a little longer, whispered more carefully, as if the air itself now carried consequence. Miss Marple walked with deliberate purpose toward the rectory, where Mrs. Wicks had arranged an informal gathering in the name of community healing. Tea and restraint were the only items on the menu. Inside, the mood was taut despite the embroidered cushions and buttered scones. Dr. Merriweather stood near the fireplace, his arms folded in front of him. Lydia kept to a far window, her eyes on the rose bushes beyond the pane. Mr. Vale, unbothered as ever, perched on the arm of a chair, smiling faintly at no one in particular. Miss Marple arrived just as Mrs. Wicks was offering another pot of Darjeeling to Isabel. "Refill, my dear," the vicar's wife offered brightly. "I've had quite enough," Isabel replied, her voice clipped, of tea and of innuendo. An awkward silence settled like fog. Miss Marple set down her knitting bag with a quiet clink. "I imagine what's more tiresome than rumors," she said pleasantly, "is when people begin to guess truths that aren't theirs to own." Mr. Vale tilted his head. "That sounds wonderfully theatrical." "It's not," Miss Marple said, looking at him steadily. "It's human." Later, as the room began to thin, and Mrs. Wicks distracted Isabel with condolences in the kitchen, Miss Marple made her move. She joined Lydia at the window. "You know," she said softly, "I once knew a girl whose uncle left her everything. She wept for days, not for the money, but because it meant he'd known how lonely she was." Lydia's shoulders tensed. "That wasn't why Edmund left it. No. He pitied me. Or trusted you," Miss Marple said. "He told you to check behind the mantle." Lydia looked away. "And yet the note accused me." "It said you knew everything," Miss Marple corrected gently. "That isn't guilt. That's awareness." Lydia's voice grew tight. "I do know things I wish I didn't." "Then tell me." She hesitated, then murmured, "Felix, he and Isabel, they weren't just friends. There were letters. I found one once, torn, but clear enough." Days. Marple nodded slowly. "And do you think Edmund discovered this?" "He knew. That's why he changed the will. He told me. He said they'd turn on each other eventually, and I must stay quiet." Outside, Miss Marple caught Mr. Vale lighting a cigarette beside the ivy wall. "Your line of work must prepare you well for murder," she remarked. He exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "We murder characters, not people, though the motivation's often the same. Betrayal, jealousy, fear." "You were fond of Edmund." Vale gave a tight smile. "He reminded me of someone I once let down. A playwright who was stolen from, blackballed, and died penniless. I suppose that made me want to protect Edmund." "And did you?" "No," he said. "I didn't act in time. I saw something I shouldn't have, and I hesitated." Miss Marple paused. "What did you see?" "The night of the gathering," he said slowly. "I came down for water. The fire had gone out, but someone was in the drawing room. A figure near the hearth, kneeling. I couldn't see who, only that they held something small, metallic." "Key? A vial?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And you didn't intervene?" "I didn't think it mattered. I assumed they were adjusting the grate. The next morning, you never mentioned it. I didn't know what I'd seen until it was too late. That evening, Miss Marple stood outside the chemist's in the failing light. Through the frosted glass, she watched Mr. Carrow, the aging pharmacist, sorting small bottles into neat rows. She tapped gently and entered. "Ah, Miss Marple," he greeted, running low on valerian again. "Not today," she smiled. "Only a question." "Go on, then." "If someone were to request cyanide, could they do so legally?" He blinked. "Only with strict permits. Industrial use, pest control, certainly not casually. And would anyone in the village have purchased something similar recently?" He pursed his lips. "Nothing matching cyanide, no. But someone did request oil of bitter almonds, common in perfumes, dangerous if distilled." "Who?" Mr. Carrow looked apologetic. "I shouldn't—" "It might save someone else," Miss Marple said gently. He hesitated, then whispered, "Dr. Merriweather asked about a compound similar to it last month. Said it was for research." That night Miss Marple penned 3 notes and lit a single candle. 1 letter for Inspector Cray, 1 for Lydia, and 1, left folded near the rosewood crucifix on her mantle, for herself, because the lies had begun to unravel, and it wasn't just the murder any more. It was what had been covered to make it look like one. Chapter 7. The next morning dawned with a restless wind, one that rattled shutters and chased the smell of damp earth through beechwoods, chimneys. A grey sky stretched flat over the village, as if holding its breath. At Ashcroft House, a maid discovered something odd while changing the linen in the late Edmund's bedroom. Inside the hollow of the bed frame, a seldom-checked crevice where the wood dipped slightly near the slats, was a folded envelope, aged at the corners, sealed but unaddressed. Inspector Cray arrived within the hour. "This yours?" he asked Isabel, holding the envelope with a gloved hand. She frowned. "I've never seen it." "It was in your brother's bed." Isabel stared at the letter as if it might hiss. Cray peeled it open carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neat and purposeful. "If anything happens to me, it will not be of my doing. There are things I was meant to stay silent about. I will not any more. The affair, the debts, the manipulation, it will end. And if I am gone, know that it was no accident." E.A. Cray folded the paper slowly, glancing toward Miss Marple, who had arrived without invitation. "You were right," he said quietly. "He feared death." Miss Marple nodded once, and he left a breadcrumb trail, 1 for the mind, 1 for the conscience. Cray tilted his head. "Which was this?" "Conscience," she said. "He wasn't just frightened, he was angry." That afternoon, Lydia walked the orchard path behind the rectory, hands deep in her coat pockets. Miss Marple fell into step beside her, like a shadow arriving late. "You've heard, I suppose," Lydia murmured. "The letter?" "Yes." Lydia stopped. "I didn't know he'd written anything else." "No one did," Miss Marple said gently. "Which is why it's so troubling." Lydia turned to face her. "You think someone tried to hide it?" "I think someone thought they had." A beat passed between them, wind combing through bare branches. "Do you know who?" Lydia asked. "I have a sense," Miss Marple replied, "but senses don't hold up in court. Patterns do." Lydia looked away. "I've been thinking. If Edmund knew about Isabel and Felix, why didn't he go to the police? Because sometimes, Miss Marple said, police ask inconvenient questions, and sometimes people like Edmund want protection without exposure. But protection from what? That, Miss Marple said softly, is what the killer hoped no one would ask. That evening, Miss Marple visited the vicar's study. The room smelled of old paper and furniture wax, the lamp casting a golden hue across the worn green rug. "I was wondering," she said to Reverend Wicks, "about the guest book from the winter fete. You still keep such records, I believe." He raised a brow. "We do, though they're hardly exciting. Mostly just donations and notes of thanks." "Could I see the one from last year?" He fetched the leather-bound volume, its spine cracked with age. She turned to the December page. There, in a looping hand, Dr. Felix Merriweather, Officiative in Donation, followed by B. Vale, Guest of Ashcroft House. Miss Marple tapped the entry. "Curious," she murmured. "Mr. Vale wasn't in Beechwood yet, not until the spring." The vicar frowned. "That's odd. Perhaps someone else signed on his behalf? Or someone signed their name before they had reason to forget they were here." The next morning Byron Vale was gone. His room at the Ralston cottage was undisturbed. His clothes remained, but his typewriter case was missing. The window latch was open. Miss Marple stood beside Cray as he inspected the scene. "Ran?" he muttered. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but not from guilt, from fear." Cray stared at her. "You still think he didn't do it?" "Only the guilty." "You still think he didn't do it?" "Only the guilty stage a scene. The innocent simply leave." Cray grunted, unconvinced. Miss Marple reached into her coat pocket and held out the porcelain button. "We found this near the fire," she said. "It matches the guest teacup set." Cray took it. "And?" "Vale was never offered tea that night." Cray's face changed. "You think it was someone else using that room?" "I do," Miss Marple said. "And I think they broke a button kneeling to retrieve a note they thought they'd buried forever." That evening, as the village absorbed news of Vale's disappearance, Dr. Merriweather sat alone in his surgery. His lamp flickered slightly. Rain tapped the glass in uneven rhythm. He reached for his drawer, paused, and instead lit a cigarette. Behind him, a creak. He turned. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, rain on her sleeves, her voice calm. "You looked for cyanide analogues. Last month he said nothing. You claimed it was for research." Still silence. She stepped forward. "The body said otherwise." Felix exhaled. "I wanted to scare him, that's all. By poisoning him. By reminding him who held the scalpel in the family." Felix said, voice fraying. "He was going to destroy Isabel. Destroy me." "Over what?" "A handful of old letters." "You switched the cups," Miss Marple said gently, "when Ivy wasn't looking." His mouth opened, closed. It was supposed to be trace, just enough to frighten him. Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. "But he was weaker than you knew." Chapter 8. The morning after her visit to Dr. Merriweather's surgery, Miss Marple invited 3 guests to tea. Not at once. No, that would have been far too theatrical. But in a slow procession over the course of a single afternoon. Each was asked for a different reason. Each believed the invitation was theirs alone. Lydia arrived first, pale and pensive, clutching a wool shawl and a wary smile. "I'm not sure why I'm here," she said, glancing around the sitting room, as Miss Marple poured the first cup of Darjeeling. "Sometimes it's easier to speak when no one expects you to," Miss Marple replied gently. Lydia lowered her gaze. "I didn't know about the second note. If I had—" Miss Marple touched her arm. "I believe you." That seemed to release something. Lydia looked up, surprised. "Then why invite me?" "To listen," said Miss Marple, "not to ask." Hour later, Isabel Grayston appeared, wearing a black coat too fitted for mourning, and a pearl brooch too deliberate for accident. Her gloves were immaculate, her expression less so. "I suppose you'll ask about Felix now," she said, not sitting. "I won't," Miss Marple replied, setting down a plate of almond biscuits. I imagine you've already asked yourself everything worth hearing." Isabel's eyes flicked toward the biscuits, then away. "I warned him not to involve himself," she said after a moment. "Men always think their intentions excuse the damage." "You encouraged the affair," Miss Marple said quietly. Isabel tilted her head. "Wouldn't you? A clever man, loyal, and just enough ambition to be useful." Miss Marple didn't answer. "Edmund never approved," Isabel went on, brushing invisible lint from her cuff. "But Edmund never approved of much. Did you know he wrote letters to a solicitor in Hastings?" Isabel stilled. "He didn't tell me." "No," said Miss Marple. "He wouldn't have." Isabel's gaze sharpened. "You think I did this?" "I think you've been rehearsing grief since before the curtain rose." For one breath, Isabel's composure fractured, but only slightly. Then she turned on her heel and left without another word. As dusk fell, Miss Marple welcomed her final guest, Inspector Cray. He arrived without his usual coat, wearing instead the expression of a man who didn't like feeling outpaced. "You've been busy," he muttered, accepting a cup of tea but not drinking it. "Sometimes watching is the greatest form of movement," Miss Marple said. "And I've done quite a bit of watching." Cray leaned back. "Let me guess. You've solved it." "No," she replied, "but I've laid the table, and I'm waiting for someone to reach for the wrong cup." He blinked. "Is that literal?" "Perhaps," she said with a faint smile. "You see, I've placed something in this house today. Not poison, of course, but the idea of it." Cray's eyes narrowed. "People who feel innocent don't look at a teacup twice," she continued. "But people with secrets, well, their eyes hesitate, their hands second-guess." Cray stared at her, then down at his untouched tea. Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly that." An hour later, Miss Marple stepped outside into the lamplight. The village green was quiet. Far across it, the windows of Ashcroft House glowed faintly. She turned toward the footpath that led behind the chapel, her step soft against the damp grass. She wasn't surprised to find someone already there. Felix Merriweather stood beneath the yew tree, pacing, agitated. His cigarette had burned down to the filter. "She's going to ruin me," he muttered as she approached. "Isabel?" Miss Marple asked. He glanced at her, startled. "Who else?" "She's already suggesting I tampered with the cups. She says I confessed to you." "You did," Miss Marple said calmly. "But I didn't mean it that way." "No," Miss Marple agreed. You meant it as fear, not guilt. Felix's face twisted. You still think it was me, don't you? I think you wanted to frighten Edmund. But fear is a blunt instrument, Dr. Merriweather. Murder is far more refined. He inhaled sharply, then exhaled. She's setting me up. Miss Marple said nothing. Felix stared at her. You know who did it? I do. Then why won't you tell me? She looked at him with something like sorrow. Because the real killer, she said softly, hasn't panicked yet. But they will. At sunrise, a maid at Ashcroft House discovered a torn envelope stuffed hastily into the kitchen stove, not fully burned. Inside was a page, charred at the corners but still legible. I only meant to frighten him. I never wanted it to go so far. But he threatened me. Said he would expose us both. He always knew too much. Signed F. Merriweather. Miss Marple read it under Cray's watchful eye. Convenient, she murmured. You don't believe it's genuine. I believe it was planted. Cray exhaled. And the killer? They're nearly finished, Miss Marple said. But they haven't realized the performance is over. Chapter 9. It was a quiet Thursday when Miss Marple requested a final meeting at Ashcroft House. No formal invitations, no inspector, just tea in the drawing-room, the same room where Edmund had died. The fire burned low this time, the tapestry above, the mantle still and silent. Ivy served the tray and retreated quickly, sensing the tension that floated like dust in the air. Isabel, Lydia, and Felix sat across from Miss Marple. No one spoke as the cups were filled. I'm grateful you've all come, Miss Marple said, folding her hands gently in her lap. I imagine this has been a trying week. Let's not pretend this is social, Isabel said coolly. If you have something to say, Miss Marple, please say it. Felix shifted in his seat but said nothing. Lydia looked only at the steam rising from her cup. Miss Marple nodded once. Very well. She turned to Felix. You didn't poison Edmund. Felix blinked. No. But you did try to frighten him. He exhaled. Yes. By introducing a trace of almond compound into his tea. Enough to make him nervous, but not enough to kill. He nodded slowly. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Lydia. And you found the note behind the mantle, just as your uncle instructed, but didn't read it fully. You assumed it was about you, and you said nothing. Lydia looked up. Her voice was quiet. I thought it was his way of blaming me. I didn't know he was trying to protect me. No, Miss Marple said. He was trying to warn you. He knew he'd become a liability to someone. She reached into her bag and withdrew the partially burned confection. This, she said, laying it gently on the tea table, was found in the kitchen stove. Signed by Dr. Merriweather, but written on Ashcroft House stationery. An older kind, the same kind used by Isabel for condolence letters. Isabel's eyes narrowed. That proves nothing. It proves timing, Miss Marple replied. This paper was already in the house. Felix doesn't keep this type in his practice. You do. Isabel waved a hand. Anyone could have taken it. True, Miss Marple agreed, but only someone who knew about the stove's faulty draft would have risked hiding a fake confession there. Assuming it would burn completely, she looked directly at Isabel. The same someone who hosted the gathering. The same someone whose porcelain guest cup was found chipped beside the fireplace. The same someone who changed her gloves the morning after the murder, because one button was missing. Silence. Felix sat back, mouth slightly open. Lydia's hand trembled on the teacup's handle. "I don't understand," Lydia whispered. "Why?" Miss Marple didn't blink. "Because Edmund was going to expose them both. The affair, yes, but also the mismanagement of funds. The estate accounts. He'd been quietly reviewing them. Isabel had dipped into the trust." Felix turned. "What?" Miss Marple continued gently now. "Edmund changed his will not just to protect Lydia, but to shield the estate. And Isabel found out. She didn't plan to kill him at first. But when Felix introduced the poison, she saw an opportunity." Isabel's voice, when it came, was brittle. "You can't prove I did anything." "No," Miss Marple said, "but your instinct betrayed you." She turned back to the tea tray. "This morning I prepared 2 sets of cups, one from the guest room, one from the main set. The guest room set has a hairline flaw. Easy to miss, unless you've handled them too recently." She picked up a cup from Isabel's saucer. "The one you reached for was not yours. It was the chipped violet-rimmed china. Your fingers found the familiar shape without thinking." Isabel said nothing. "Because that was the cup you used the night Edmund died," Miss Marple finished softly. "You thought it clean, but you had placed the vial Felix discarded into his tea, not to frighten, but to finish the job." Felix stood. "You used me." Isabel didn't meet his eyes. Lydia's voice broke the silence. "He trusted you, Aunt. Protected us," Isabel snapped. "He was going to throw it all away for that girl and a moral tantrum." "But he was your brother," Lydia said. "Not an obstacle." Isabel's voice grew cold. "He was weak, and weak men cost strong women everything." Inspector Cray stepped in from the hall then, where he had been waiting quietly, Miss Marple's final arrangement. He looked at Isabel. "We'll need a statement." Isabel rose, brushing invisible dust from her coat. "Of course." She paused by Miss Marple's chair. "You've ruined everything." "No," Miss Marple said calmly. "You did that the moment you believed truth could be managed." Chapter 10. 2 days had passed since Isabel Greyston was escorted from Ashcroft House, under Inspector Cray's quiet supervision. The village of Beechwood-on-Hart, always adept at whispering behind teacups, now whispered louder and with more accuracy than usual. Miss Marple, however, was not one to indulge in speculation when certainty had already been earned. She had invited Lydia, Felix, and Inspector Cray to her parlour, not to reopen the case, but to close it, cleanly and completely. "I thought it best," she said gently, as she poured tea, "that you heard everything as it happened, in the correct order. No speculation, no confusion." Cray nodded. "Please." Miss Marple folded her hands. "It began, as these things often do, with fear." "Edmund," Lydia said softly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "He suspected something, likely long before the affair between Isabel and Dr. Merriweather began in earnest. But when he discovered it, and the mishandling of the estate accounts, he took action quietly, not to shame anyone, but to protect what remained. And he changed the will," Cray said. And left a clue, Miss Marple added. The hidden note behind the tapestry, which referenced Lydia, not as a suspect, but as someone who knew more than she realized. He trusted her. Felix shifted uncomfortably. And I made it worse. You did, Miss Marple said, not unkindly, but not maliciously. You bought oil of bitter almonds, a compound not easily found. You used it in trace amounts, hoping to shake Edmund into silence. Felix lowered his eyes. I never wanted him dead. But Isabel did, Miss Marple said. Not originally, I think. But when she realized what you had done, when she saw the opportunity, she acted, quickly, coldly. She retrieved the vial you'd discarded and added just enough to ensure Edmund wouldn't wake. Lydia's voice wavered. But how did she know? She was watching. Isabel always watched, and she understood timing better than most. That night, while the rest of you mingled, she entered the drawing room alone. The tapestry had moved. That was Colonel Merriman's accidental observation. She retrieved the note Edmund had hidden and rewrote it, making it appear accusatory toward Lydia. Gray nodded. We never saw the original. She replaced it before the body was discovered, Miss Marple continued, and she used a cup from the guest set, accidentally breaking a porcelain button from her glove as she knelt. The same glove she discarded the next day. She tried to frame me, Felix said bitterly. She did, Miss Marple said, but too perfectly. The false confession, the clean narrative. The guilty always overplay their neatness. And Mr. Vale? Lydia asked. Miss Marple's smile flickered. A red herring. He'd seen something, Isabel entering the drawing room, but he hadn't understood what he saw until it was too late. When word spread of Edmund's poisoning, he panicked. Not because he was guilty, but because he realized he might be blamed. He fled, which was foolish, but human. Gray exhaled. We'll put out word to find him. He's not wanted for anything now. Miss Marple nodded. Good. Silence settled for a moment. Then Lydia asked, How did you know for certain it was Isabel? Miss Marple's eyes softened. Because she hesitated. At what? At tea, Miss Marple said. This morning I offered her a cup from the guest set, matching the chipped one found by the hearth. She reached for it instinctively. Her fingers had memorized its weight. She didn't realize it, but she chose the wrong cup, not her usual set. Felix gave a weak laugh. All that over a teacup? People reveal themselves in the smallest gestures, Miss Marple said, gently. That's how murder always unravels. Not through the grand lies, but the tiny truths that can't be rehearsed. Cray stood. I'll finalize the report tonight. You've made this much easier than it might have been, Miss Marple offered a small smile. It's always easier once the truth is willing to be seen. As the others took their leave, Lydia lingered. I don't know what to do now, she admitted. Everything feels untethered. Miss Marple touched her arm. That's how healing begins, with the feeling of unfamiliar peace. Lydia managed to nod. Thank you. When Miss Marple was finally alone, she sat beside the hearth where the fire crackled softly. She stared for a moment at the faint ash stain left by the button, cleaned, but not entirely gone. The truth always leaves something behind, she thought. But this time, the scar was faint. The village would carry on, as it always did. Quiet, watchful, and never quite the same again. Chapter 11. Ashcroft House was quiet again. The windows remained shuttered. The ivy, unpruned, curled against the stone like forgotten hands. A "To-Let" sign had been discreetly placed beside the iron gate, but no one in the village expected it to move soon. Justice had come swiftly and quietly. Isabel Grayston had not contested the charges. Her solicitor had issued a single statement, blaming stress, grief, and emotional confusion. But no one in Beechwood believed confusion could lace a teacup with precision. At the grocer's, whispers had shifted from "Did you hear?" to "It's a pity, really." In the bakery, Mrs. Tilling had taken to sighing over buns. At the vicarage, Mrs. Wicks organized a modest floral tribute to Edmund Ashcroft, now resting in the Chattel grounds beside his father. And yet the air in Beechwood-on-Hart did not feel cleaner. It felt thinner, as if a thread had snapped and could not be retied. Felix Merriweather resigned from his practice. He said it was voluntary, but the empty windows of his former surgery said otherwise. His departure was not announced. One morning the sign was gone, and by supper so was he. No one inquired where he had gone. Some truths didn't require closure, only distance. Lydia remained in the village. She moved into a modest cottage near the edge of St. Catherine's Wood, where the foxgloves bloomed thick in the spring. She took up work cataloguing books for the vicarage and reading to the children at the Chattel schoolhouse. People whispered, of course, about the money, the inheritance, the scandal. But Miss Marple noticed how Lydia never flinched under their glances. In a village built on judgment, endurance was a kind of triumph. Miss Marple received a letter 1 week after the trial concluded. It was unsigned, written on thick theatre paper, folded twice. Inside was a single sentence, "Thank you for letting me disappear." There was no return address, but Miss Marple placed it gently beside her copy of Cranford and smiled faintly. Siren Vale had understood something most men never did, that vanishing, when done with dignity, was not cowardice. It was grace. One afternoon, Miss Marple walked with Colonel Merriman near the Chapel Green. He was slower these days. His joints stiffened more quickly in the cold, but his conversation remained brisk. "I still can't believe she fooled us all," he muttered, tipping his hat at Mrs. Lumley as they passed. "Isabel, I always thought her a bit sharp." "Yes, but never cruel." "I always thought her a bit sharp." "Yes, but never cruel." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "Cruelty often wears civility's mask, especially in drawing-rooms," glanced sideways. "Do you ever feel it wasn't worth it, Jane, finding out?" Miss Marple paused. "Sometimes, but truth, Colonel, is like snow. It doesn't ask permission to fall, and it never arrives without changing the landscape." He grunted. "Well, I suppose we needed the frost." That evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, the fire soft, the knitting in her lap barely touched. She thought of Edmund, his quiet dignity, his faded sadness. He had not been a perfect man. He had withheld truths until too late, but he had died trying to protect what he believed was still worth saving. And she thought of Isabel, not as the villain the newspapers now painted her, but as a woman who had once loved power more than people, and who paid for it with silence. Murder was never just about death. It was about what people couldn't live with, and what they'd do to avoid it. The tea had cooled beside her. Outside, a blackbird sang against the dusk. Beechwood on Hart would sleep soundly again. But something had shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet space where innocence had once lived. Chapter 12. It was a quiet Thursday when the parcel arrived. The postman handed it to Miss Marple with an apologetic look. "Bit heavier than usual, I'm afraid, miss," before tipping his cap and wheeling off down the lane, wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine, and bearing no sender's name. The parcel felt oddly warm in her hands. Miss Marple brought it into the parlour and set it beside the hearth, pausing to collect her spectacles from their usual spot on the writing-desk. She slit the string with a letter-opener, careful not to tear the paper, as though respecting some final formality. Inside, nestled among crisp tissue, lay a single object, a faded blue leather-bound journal. She recognized it instantly. Edmund's. She had glimpsed it once on the desk at Ashcroft House, its spine cracked, its corners softened by years of touch. Pinned to the first page was a note, handwritten in a looping, deliberate script. She asked me to burn it. I chose not to. If anyone ought to know what the last truth was, it's you. Miss Marple sat back in her armchair, fingers resting lightly on the cover. For several minutes she did not open it. She simply listened, to the ticking of the mantel clock, to the hush of the village beyond the window, to her own breath. Then she turned the first page. The journal was not long. Edmund's entries were erratic, scattered over 5 years. Most were practical. Notes about parish repairs, thoughts on sermons, the occasional line of poetry he had copied for reflection. But midway through the book, the tone shifted. Isabel has changed, or perhaps I have. I no longer understand what she guards so tightly within herself. There's a shadow there. It speaks in silence, even when her smile is sweet. Later, she visits Felix too often. I tell myself it is concern for the sick, for the poor. But my heart, it tightens whenever she returns home without explanation. And finally, I have seen the bottle. I know the label. It is poison. Why it rests in our cabinet, I do not ask. But I have moved it, hidden it in the hollow of the chapel pulpit. A foolish place, perhaps, but I cannot destroy it. Not yet. Miss Marple paused there, the hollow of the chapel pulpit. She recalled the feeling she had during the funeral, the odd tilt in the floorboards, the faint scent that lingered. She had chalked it up to memory, to grief thick in the air, but Edmund had been trying, even in the end, to leave one last trail, one final act of quiet resistance. She continued reading. If I am gone by unnatural means, then no. It was not weakness that silenced me. It was love. I thought love could protect, even redeem. But I was wrong. Some sins dig roots too deep to pull. Miss Marple set the journal aside. She rose slowly, slipped on her shawl, and stepped into the soft light of evening. The chapel was empty, the scent of wax and wood lingering faintly. Her footsteps echoed gently against the flagstone floor. She approached the pulpit without hesitation. Her hands, though marked with age, moved steadily, She found the loose panel beneath the lectern, the one carved just slightly differently from the rest. Inside lay the bottle, its contents long gone, the label dulled by time, but the words still legible. Belladonna. She did not touch it, she simply looked at it, then replaced the panel. There was no need to report it now. The truth had already moved past the need for punishment. Edmund had done what he could. And in the end, it was enough. Back in her parlor, she returned the journal to its wrapping and tied the string once more. It would go in the back cupboard, beneath the old gardening almanacs and disused tins of buttons, somewhere safe but not unreachable. One day, someone might ask again what really happened in Beechwood-on-Hart, and there would be an answer. But not today. That evening, Miss Marple attended the spring recital at the chapel school. Lydia sat at the front with the children, helping them read lines from The Wind in the Willows. She smiled often now, not broadly, but with softness, a woman unburdened. Afterward, as the crowd filed out into the lantern-lit path, Lydia touched Miss Marple's arm. Was it all worth it? She asked quietly. Miss Marple looked at her. Justice rarely feels like triumph, my dear. But truth is always worth the telling. As she returned home, the stars blinked steadily above. The village was quiet, no whispers now, no hidden glances. Ashcroft House would remain empty. Byron Vale would remain unnamed, and the bottle in the chapel would remain undisturbed. But the story had been told, and more importantly, understood.